My son stood up at his own birthday dinner, lifted his glass, and told a table of 12 people that his father doesn't pay for anything anymore. He said it laughing. He said it like it was a fact everybody already knew, like it was a punchline he'd been saving. Grandpa doesn't pay for anything anymore. That's what he said, word for word, in front of his boss, in front of his wife, in front of my daughter. I sat there and smiled because that's what you do. That's what I trained myself to do for 3 years. But I want you to remember that sentence, because 40 minutes later, a young waiter in a black apron walked over to that table, placed a credit card directly into my son's hand, and said something quiet enough that only the two of them should have heard it. Bradley didn't hear it quietly. His face heard it loud. My name is Walter Bregman. I'm 67 years old. I spent 38 years building a mechanical supply company out of a rented warehouse on McClintock Drive in Tempe, Arizona, and I retired believing I understood exactly who my son was. I was wrong about that in ways I'm still discovering. This is the story of the night I found out how wrong, and the one moment at that dinner table I will remember for the rest of my life. Let me back up, because if I don't, you won't understand why I let it get that far before I did anything about it. Welcome to Sweet Family Revenge. If you're new here, this channel is about families, about the people who quietly hold everything together, and the people who take that for granted until the bill comes due. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight, and stay with me, because this one earns every minute. I built Bregman Mechanical Supply in 1985 out of a 1,200 square foot warehouse with 2 employees and a used forklift I bought at auction for $400. By the time I sold the company in 2019, we had 61 employees, 3 distribution contracts with commercial HVAC installers across the Phoenix metro, and a client list I could recite in my sleep. I sold it for a number that let Carol and me retire comfortably into a house on Ironwood Drive in Paradise Valley, the kind of house with a pool we barely swim in and a guest room that mostly holds Christmas decorations. Carol's my wife of 39 years. She taught 4th grade for 3 decades before she retired the same year I did. And she is, without question, the most patient person I have ever known, which you'll understand is relevant later. We have 2 children. Bradley is 39. He's sharp, articulate, good-looking in the way that gets him noticed in rooms, and he works as a vice president at a hedge fund called Ashcroft Capital Partners, downtown Scottsdale, on Camelback Road. His wife Diane is 37, kind, a little quieter than Bradley, works part-time doing marketing for a dental practice. They have a son, Mason, who's 9 and still thinks I'm the funniest person alive, which tells you something about a 9-year-old's sense of humor. Our daughter Claire is 34. She's an emergency room nurse at Scottsdale Osborne Medical Center, works 12-hour shifts 3 or 4 days a week, drives a Honda Civic with 210,000 miles on it that I've offered to replace more times than I can count, and every single time she tells me the same thing. It runs fine, Dad. Don't waste your money. I want you to hold on to that sentence, too. It matters later. Here's what I believe for most of my life. I believe that if you worked hard and built something real, and if you were generous with your children without spoiling them, they would grow up understanding the difference between what they earned and what they were given. I believed Bradley understood that difference. I was wrong, and it took me 67 years and 1 credit card statement to find out how wrong. It started 3 years ago, in the spring, when Bradley called me on a Sunday afternoon while Carol and I were out on the back patio. He'd just started at Ashcroft Capital. New job, new expense structure, and he explained that the reimbursement cycle for business travel was running 6 to 8 weeks behind, which was putting a strain on his cash flow. Could he be added as an authorized user on one of my cards, just temporarily, just to bridge the gap until the firm got its reimbursement system sorted out? I didn't think twice. I had an American Express Platinum card I barely used, mostly for the airline credits, and I called the bank that Monday and added him. I told him to keep his charges reasonable and to let me know when the firm fixed its reimbursement issue, so I could take him back off. He never told me the issue got fixed, and I never checked. That's on me. I want to be honest about that part, because it matters. For 3 years, I trusted my son the way you trust someone you raised, which is to say, completely, without a second thought, and without ever once looking at a statement. The first crack came on a Tuesday in early September, an ordinary evening, nothing dramatic about it at all. Carol and I were having dinner in the kitchen, and my phone buzzed with a fraud alert from American Express. A charge of $18,400 at a jewelry store called Sabatini Fine Jewelers on Fifth Avenue in Scottsdale. The alert asked me to confirm or deny the charge. I stared at it for a long moment, because I hadn't bought jewelry in years, and Carol's birthday wasn't until November. I denied the charge, out of instinct, and the bank called me within 10 minutes. The representative asked a few questions, and then, almost as an aside, mentioned that the charge had actually been made by the secondary cardholder, Bradley Bregman, and did I want to keep the authorization active or remove it given the dispute. I told her to leave it active for now. I said I needed to look into something first. That night, I logged into the account online for the first time in longer than I care to admit, and I want to tell you, the number that came up when I pulled 12 months of statements did not look like a bridge loan for reimbursement delays. It looked like a second life. I didn't say anything to Carol that night. I want to be honest about that too. I sat in my study until almost 1 in the morning scrolling through 18 months of transaction history, and what I found sat in my chest like a stone I'd swallowed whole. There were monthly charges, $2,800, recurring on the 3rd of every month, to a property management company called Sonoran Ridge Leasing, an apartment complex off Rural Road in Tempe. 18 months of them. There were charges at a spa called Bloom Aesthetics on Scottsdale Road, recurring every 3 weeks, ranging from $300 to $900. There were dinners, plenty of dinners, at restaurants I'd never heard of, always for two. Always on nights I happened to know Bradley told Diane he was working late. And then there was the $18,000 charge at Sabatini Fine Jewelers, dated 4 days before the alert came through, for what the itemized receipt, which I requested from the bank the following week, described as 1 Cartier love bracelet, 18-karat gold. I didn't buy Carol a Cartier bracelet. I never had. I sat there in my study that night and did the math the way you do math you don't want to do, over and over, hoping it comes out different. It never did. $2,800 a month for 18 months on an apartment is $50,400. Add the spa, the dinners, the bracelet, and I was looking at a card I had extended in good faith 3 years earlier that had quietly funded, by my rough count, somewhere north of $90,000 of a life I knew absolutely nothing about. I didn't know it yet, but that number was going to look small compared to what I'd find over the following 4 weeks. The next morning, I called an old friend from the Rotary Club, a man named Gerald Voss, who'd retired from 30 years running his own investigations firm before selling it to his nephew. I asked him who I should call if I needed someone quiet, someone thorough, someone who wouldn't ask why an old man wanted to know about his own son. Gerald gave me a name. Dennis Kowalski. Office in Tempe, off Southern Avenue. 22 years in the business, most of it doing exactly this kind of work for people who'd rather not go through their own family to get an honest answer. I met Dennis at a coffee shop on Mill Avenue the following Thursday. He was a big man, quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from decades of listening more than talking. I told him everything. The apartment charges, the spa, the bracelet, the pattern of late nights. I told him about Renee Foss, a name I'd found buried in a text notification that had flashed across Bradley's phone one Sunday when he left it on our kitchen counter to help me carry groceries in. I hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Now I couldn't stop thinking about it. Dennis wrote everything down in a small spiral notebook, the old-fashioned kind, and when I finished, he looked up and asked me one question. How long has he had access to your money? 3 years, I told him. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when a number confirms something he already suspected. That's not a mistake, Mr. Bregman, he said. A mistake is 1 bad month. 3 years is a system. 2 weeks later, Dennis called me with what he had. Renee Foss, 27 years old, hired at Ashcroft Capital 14 months earlier as a junior analyst, though according to Dennis's sources inside the firm, most of her actual job function involved sitting in meetings Bradley ran and laughing at things that weren't especially funny. She lived in Unit 214 at Sonoran Ridge, the same complex, the same $2,800 a month, going back 18 months, for months longer than she'd technically been employed at the firm, which told me the relationship predated the job, or the job had been arranged to make the relationship easier to disguise. Dennis had photographs. I'm not going to describe them to you. I looked at them once, in his office, and I never asked to see them again. There's more, Dennis said, and something in the way he said it told me this wasn't going to be the kind of more that made anything better. He told me Bradley had spent the last several months building a story inside his own firm, a story about himself, about where he came from. According to two separate people Dennis had spoken to, Bradley had told his boss, Richard Ashcroft, and several colleagues, that he came from nothing, that his father, meaning me, had run a small operation that failed in the 2008 recession, that I'd struggled financially for years afterward, and that everything Bradley had, the house in Gilbert, the leased Tesla, the private school tuition for Mason, he'd built entirely on his own, clawing his way up from a household that couldn't help him. He told people I was, and I'm quoting Dennis quoting one of Bradley's colleagues directly, a nice old guy who doesn't really have much left, which was apparently his explanation at a firm holiday party for why I drove a 12-year-old truck to family events. I own that truck because I like that truck. I could buy the dealership. I sat in my study that night with Dennis's folder in front of me, and I felt something I want to describe honestly, because I think it matters more than the anger did. I felt grief. Not for the money. I want to be clear about that, because people ask. The money never mattered to me the way people assume it does when they hear a number like $90,000. What sat in my chest that night was the realization that my son had spent 3 years constructing a version of himself, and a version of me, built entirely on erasing what I'd actually given him, because the truth, the plain, unglamorous truth that his father had helped him, didn't fit the story he wanted to tell about himself. He hadn't just been stealing from a card. He'd been stealing my whole life and rewriting it as a hardship he'd overcome. I called Claire that week, not to tell her anything, just because I needed to hear a voice that hadn't been rearranged into a story. She picked up on the second ring, still in her scrubs. I could tell by the background noise, the particular hum of a hospital corridor. "Dad," she said, "everything okay? You never call on a Wednesday. Just wanted to hear your voice," I told her, which was true, and also not the whole truth. And Claire, being Claire, let it go without pressing, because that's who she is. She asked about Carol, told me about a rough shift she'd had the night before, a car accident on the 101, 3 teenagers, all of them going to be fine, thank God. And then she said something that I've thought about many times since. "You sound tired, Dad. Are you sleeping okay?" I told her I was fine. Another lie, though a smaller one, and one I think she saw through, because before we hung up she said, "Call me if you need anything." I mean that. I'm 20 minutes away. I didn't call her again that week, but I remembered that she offered. I want to pause here because this is the part where a lot of people who haven't lived it, would say, "Walter, just confront him. Call him tonight. Put it all on the table, get it over with." And believe me, some part of me wanted exactly that. But another part of me, the part that spent 38 years negotiating contracts with men who thought they were smarter than they were, knew that a confrontation you have alone, in private, is a conversation your son can talk his way around. A confrontation with witnesses, with evidence already laid out where no one can argue with the paper in front of them. That's not a conversation. That's a verdict. So I waited. I gathered. If you've been listening for a while, this is a good moment to hit that subscribe button, because what happens over the next few minutes is the part people tell me they replay twice. I called my attorney the following Monday. Howard Klein, an estate and business lawyer with an office off Scottsdale Road near Old Town, a man I'd used for 30 years, careful, precise, the kind of lawyer who reads every document twice before he lets you sign anything. I sat across from him and told him everything. And Howard listened the way Howard always listens, without interrupting, taking notes in handwriting so small I've never once been able to read it upside down. When I finished, he set his pen down and asked me the same question Dennis had asked, in different words. "What do you want to do, Walter?" "I want 3 things," I told him. "I want the card authorization pulled immediately, quietly, no warning. I want a new trust drafted that reflects reality instead of assumption. And I want to know, before I do anything else, exactly what else my son has touched that has my name on it." Howard nodded slowly and started writing. That last question turned out to matter more than I expected, because 2 days later, while Howard's paralegal was pulling records, we found something that made the apartment and the bracelet look almost small by comparison. 6 weeks before that dinner, before any of this had come to light, Bradley had gone to my accountant, a man named Phil Osei who'd handled my personal finances since I sold the company, and told him he was helping me set up an home equity line of credit against the house on Ironwood Drive, $500,000, for what he described to Phil as my planned kitchen and pool renovation. Phil, Trusting Bradley the same way I had trusted him for 39 years, had begun processing preliminary paperwork, and had even asked Bradley to have me sign a preliminary authorization form, which Bradley told him he'd already gotten notarized and would drop off. I never signed anything. I never planned a kitchen renovation. I certainly never authorized a $500,000 line of credit against a house that was, at that point, still entirely, fully, unquestionably mine. Phil called me directly, confused, the moment Howard's office reached out asking about the paperwork, and when I told him I had no idea what he was talking about, there was a long silence on the line before Phil said, quietly, "Walter, I think somebody was about to forge your signature." I sat with that for a long time. My son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike on the sidewalk in front of our old house in Tempe, the boy I'd sat with in the ER waiting room at 2 in the morning after he broke his wrist skateboarding at 15, had been 6 weeks away from putting a forged signature on a document that would have put my house at risk to fund I didn't even know what. A bigger apartment for Renee, maybe. A ring. I never found out exactly, because we stopped it before it happened, and I want to be honest with you, I've never asked him directly, because by the time I had the chance to ask, I no longer wanted to hear his answer. That was the moment something in me went from hurt to decided. There's a difference, and it's an important one. Hurt makes you reactive. Decided makes you patient. I told Howard to pull the card authorization the following week, timed for a specific date. Bradley's 40th birthday dinner was coming up on a Saturday in late October, a celebration Diane had been planning for 2 months, held at a steakhouse called the Mesquite Room on Camelback Road, the kind of place with dry-aged beef and a wine list you need reading glasses to get through. It had also, conveniently, and not by my design, turned into something bigger. Bradley had just been told, informally, that he was being considered for a promotion to senior vice president, and his boss, Richard Ashcroft, along with Richard's wife Pamela, had accepted an invitation to join the dinner. Diane had told me on the phone that it was going to be a big night for Bradley, professionally and personally, and could I please make sure I came, since Bradley had specifically asked for me to be there. I remember thinking, sitting in my study with Howard's card removal paperwork in front of me, that Bradley had no idea how right he was about it being a big night. I told Howard I wanted the authorization pulled the morning of the dinner, not before, not after. Precisely that morning, so there would be no gap where Bradley might notice something was wrong before he needed the card in front of the one audience that mattered most to him. "Are you sure about the timing, Walter?" Howard asked me. "Once that card declines in front of his boss, there's no taking that moment back." "I've never been more sure of anything," I told him. The morning of the dinner, I called Carol into the study and told her everything. I hadn't told her a single piece of it until that morning, not the apartment, not Renee, not the forged signature attempt, because I needed to be sure of every fact before I put that weight on her, and because some part of me, I'll admit, was ashamed. Ashamed that I hadn't caught it sooner. Ashamed that I'd raised a son capable of it. Carol sat very still while I talked. She's not a woman who cries easily. 39 years of marriage, and I could count the times on one hand. But by the time I finished, her eyes were wet, and her jaw was set in that particular way I've learned means she's already made a decision and isn't interested in discussing alternatives. "He's going to sit at that table tonight," she said, "and act like nothing is wrong. And so are we. Until it's time." I nodded. "I want you to know something about you," I said. "Whatever happens tonight, I need you standing next to me, not behind me." She reached over and took my hand. "I've been standing next to you for 39 years, Walter," she said. "I'm not stopping tonight." I called Claire that afternoon, and this time I told her everything too. "I need you there tonight," I said. "Not to do anything, just to be there." There was a long pause on the line, and then Claire said, quietly, "I've been wondering for a while if something was going on with him." I didn't want to say anything because I didn't have proof. Just a feeling. "What kind of feeling?" I asked. "He borrowed money from me 8 months ago," she said. "For $1,000. Told me it was for a work expense that hadn't been reimbursed yet, and he'd pay me back within a month. He never mentioned it again, and I never brought it up because I didn't want to make things weird between us over money." I sat with that for a moment, and I felt something crack open a little further in my chest, because Claire, my daughter who drives a Civic with 210,000 miles on it, because she won't let me buy her a new car, who works 12-hour overnight shifts stabilizing strangers in the worst moments of their lives, had quietly handed her brother $4,000 she never mentioned to anyone, and never once complained that it hadn't come back. I'll be there tonight, Dad, she said. Whatever you need. We arrived at the mesquite room at 7 that evening. Diane had reserved the private room in the back. Round tables, low lighting, the kind of restaurant that makes everyone at the table look a little more important than they are. Richard Ashcroft and his wife Pamela were already there when we walked in. Richard in a sport coat that probably cost more than my first car, easy and confident in the way men get when they've never once had to justify their place in a room. Bradley met us at the door, wearing a smile so wide and so practiced I almost didn't recognize the sun underneath it. Dad, he said, clapping me on the shoulder. Glad you made it. Big night. You have no idea, I told him, and I meant it 2 different ways, and only one of them was the way he heard it. We sat. The wine came out. Mason, who'd been allowed to stay up past his bedtime for the occasion, sat between Diane and Claire, drawing on the paper tablecloth with the crayons the restaurant provides for exactly that purpose. Richard Ashcroft raised a toast early in the evening, congratulating Bradley on what he called an extraordinary rise, a young man who came from nothing and built a career on pure grit and talent, and I watched Bradley receive that compliment with a small, humble nod, the exact performance of a man who has told this story so many times he's stopped noticing it's a lie. Somewhere around the second course, Richard turned to me, friendly, curious, the way successful men are curious about the fathers of other successful men. And what did you do before you retired, Walter? He asked. I ran a mechanical supply company, I told him. 38 years. Small operation, Bradley cut in, before I could say another word, laughing a little as he said it. The way you laugh when you're managing a story instead of telling one. Struggled for a long stretch after '08, honestly. Dad's had it tough for years. He gestured toward me with his wine glass. And here's where the sentence came, the one I told you at the start of this, the one I want you to remember. Grandpa doesn't pay for anything anymore, he said, and the table laughed, a warm, easy laugh, because it landed exactly the way Bradley wanted it to land. Self-deprecating on the surface. A little joke about the old man. Underneath it, a story about a self-made son who'd left his struggling father behind and built something better. I smiled. I want you to understand that. I smiled, and I picked up my wine glass, and I let the moment pass, because I had already decided, weeks earlier, that this wasn't going to be a conversation I started. It was going to be one he started, without knowing it, the moment the check came. And it came, near the end of the meal, the way it always did. Bradley reached for it before it even fully landed on the table, the way he'd done at every family dinner for 3 years, waving off Diane's offer to split it, waving off mine, performing generosity for a room full of people who had no idea whose money made that generosity possible. He pulled out his wallet, slid a black card across the table to the waiter, a young man, mid-20s, name tag that read Marcus, and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "This one's on me." I watched Marcus walk away with the card. I watched Bradley lean back in his chair, one arm draped over the back of Diane's, glowing under Richard Ashcroft's approval. The picture of a man who had built everything himself. 3 minutes passed. Then 5. Marcus came back to the table, and I want you to picture this the way I saw it, because I've replayed it more times than I can count. He walked with the particular careful posture of a young man who has been trained to handle an awkward moment with dignity for both parties. He didn't announce anything to the table. He leaned down slightly toward Bradley, and he placed the card directly into Bradley's hand. The same card that 10 minutes earlier had left that hand with total confidence. And he said something quiet. I was close enough to hear it. I don't think he intended the whole table to hear it, but Bradley's reaction made sure they did. I'm sorry, sir, Marcus said. The card was declined. And the name on the account is Walter Bregman, not yours. I wasn't sure if you wanted to use a different card, or if Mr. Bregman here would like to take care of it. The table went very quiet. The particular quiet you get when 12 people simultaneously understand that something has shifted and none of them are sure yet what it means. Richard Ashcroft's expression didn't change much, but I saw something behind his eyes recalibrate, the way a sharp man's expression does when a piece of information rearranges everything he thought he knew about a person sitting across from him. Bradley's smile didn't disappear all at once. I want to describe it accurately because it matters. It drained, slowly, the way water leaves a tub, starting at the eyes and working its way down until there was nothing left holding it up. Dad, he said, that's not right. There must be some mistake with the... There's no mistake, Bradley, I said, and I kept my voice exactly as calm as I'd kept it every single day for the past 4 weeks. I called the bank this morning and removed you from the account. The table was silent enough that I could hear the ice settling in someone's water glass 3 seats down. Why would you do that? He said, and his voice had climbed half an octave. The sound of a man trying very hard to keep something under control that was no longer under his control at all. Because I found out where the money's been going, I said. I want to be clear, I never raised my voice that entire night. Not once. And I think that's part of why the room stayed with me instead of him. I reached down beside my chair, where I'd left a plain manila folder that had been sitting in my car since we left the house, and I set it on the table in front of me, unopened, and I let it sit there for a moment before I spoke again. 3 years ago, I said, I added you to a card so you could bridge a reimbursement gap at your new job. You told me it was temporary. I never checked the statements, because I trusted you. That was my mistake, and I own it. But I checked them a month ago, Bradley, after the bank flagged a charge I didn't recognize. $18,400 at a jewelry store for a bracelet I never bought your mother. Diane, who had been sitting very still beside him, turned her head slowly toward Bradley. I watched her face do something complicated, the particular expression of a woman doing rapid math she desperately does not want to finish. I opened the folder. I didn't read every line out loud, and I want you to understand why, because it matters. I wasn't trying to destroy my son in a restaurant for an audience. I was trying to make sure that everyone at that table who had been lied to deliberately, repeatedly, for their own comfort, finally had the truth in front of them, plainly, without room for a story to grow back around it. $2,800 a month, I said, to an apartment complex in Tempe for 18 months. A relationship with a woman named Renee Foss, who I understand works at your firm, Richard. I looked at Richard Ashcroft as I said it, not cruelly, just directly, because he deserved to know what he'd actually hired and promoted. 6 weeks ago, my son went to my accountant and began the paperwork to put a $500,000 line of credit against my house, using a signature I never gave him. My lawyer stopped that before it went anywhere. And tonight, in front of your boss, he told a room full of people that his father struggled for years and never really had anything. When the truth is I built a company that put every dollar behind the life he's standing in right now. The house, the lease on that car in the driveway, Mason's school, all of it. The room didn't move. Mason, God bless him, 9 years old and utterly unaware of the weight in the air, was still coloring on the tablecloth, and some part of me is grateful for that small mercy, that a 9-year-old boy got to keep his crayons a few minutes longer before he had to understand any of this. Dad, Bradley said, and his voice had gone thin now. Please, not here. We can talk about this at home. I can explain. You had 3 years to explain it, I said. You had 6 weeks since the loan paperwork. You had every single dinner where you told people I didn't have anything. I'm not the one who chose here, Bradley. You chose here. The moment you decided the story you wanted to tell your boss was more important than the truth you owed your wife. Diane stood up. She didn't say anything dramatic. She picked up her purse, looked at Bradley for a long moment, the kind of look that doesn't need words because words would only get in the way, and she said, quietly, take me home. Not you drive me home. Just, take me home. The way you'd say it to end something, not continue it. Richard Ashcroft folded his napkin and set it on the table. The gesture of a man who has decided there's nothing left worth staying for. We should get going, he said to Pamela, and as they stood, he looked at Bradley one last time, and I watched 30 seconds of a career built on a false story evaporate in his expression. We'll talk on Monday, he said, and I don't think either of us needed him to say anything more specific than that for Bradley to understand exactly what kind of conversation Monday was going to be. I paid for the dinner myself, with my own card, the one that had always been in my own name. If you enjoyed hearing how that folder landed, stay with me, because what happened over the following month is the part people tell me matters even more than that dinner did. I didn't speak to Bradley again for 11 days. He called, many times, and left messages that moved through every stage you'd expect. Anger, then bargaining, then something that sounded close to grief, though I've learned to be careful about trusting which grief is real and which grief is strategy. Diane moved into her sister's house in Chandler with Mason the week after the dinner and filed for legal separation 17 days later. She and I still talk, actually, more than Bradley and I do now, mostly about Mason, about making sure he has what he needs, about a boy who deserves better than what got handed to him that night. And I've made a quiet decision, one I haven't told Bradley about, to set aside a fund for Mason's education directly, in a trust his father cannot touch. Richard Ashcroft, I heard through Howard, quietly moved forward with the promotion review the following month, and Bradley did not get it. I don't know all the details of what happened at that firm, and I've made a point of not asking, because it isn't mine to know anymore. I called Phil Osei the Monday after the dinner and formally closed every joint account, every authorization, every thread that still connected my name to Bradley's finances. I revoked the lease guarantee on the Tesla. I stopped the monthly contribution I'd quietly been making toward Mason's private school tuition, not because I stopped caring about my grandson, but because I redirected it, every dollar, into a 529 plan in Mason's name that Bradley cannot access, cannot borrow against, cannot ever touch. And then I sat down with Howard, and I rewrote the trust. The old one split everything evenly between Bradley and Claire, the way you'd expect, the way I'd always assumed was fair because I never imagined I'd need to think about it any other way. The new one is different. Claire receives the house on Ironwood Drive outright, along with the bulk of the estate. Bradley's portion is reduced to a fixed amount, enough that I can say honestly I never cut my son off entirely, because despite everything, he is still my son, but not $1 more than that fixed amount, ever, under any circumstance. I also did something Claire doesn't know about yet. Something I haven't told her, because I want her to hear it from me directly rather than through a story on a screen. I called her mortgage company 2 weeks ago and paid off the remaining balance on her condo in full, $134,000, and I've arranged for the paperwork to arrive at her door as a surprise, along with a note that says exactly what I wanted to say. For every $4,000 you never mentioned, and every ride you gave me to a doctor's appointment when you just finished a 12-hour shift, and every time you told me your Civic runs fine when we both knew it barely does. This isn't a loan. This is what loyalty actually earns. She's going to call me crying when that letter arrives, and I'm going to let her, because some tears are worth every bit of the wait. I want to tell you what I said to Bradley when I finally called him back on the 12th day, because I think it matters more than anything that happened at that dinner table. He answered on the first ring, quiet, none of the performance left in his voice. I love you, I told him. That part hasn't changed, and it isn't going to change. But love isn't the same as trust, and it isn't the same as access, and right now you don't have either of those things from me. You spent 3 years telling people a story where I had nothing to offer you. Congratulations, son. You got exactly what you asked for. There was a long silence on the line, and then he said, quietly, how do I fix this, Dad? I don't know. I told him honestly. That's not a question I can answer for you, but I'll tell you where you can start. You can stop telling people a story about where you came from and start telling the truth, even when the truth is less impressive. That's the only foundation anything real gets built on. I learned that at 29 years old in a rented warehouse with a forklift I bought at auction. You're going to have to learn it at 39 in whatever room you're standing in when you finally stop performing. I hung up the phone that night and sat on the back patio with Carol, the pool lights throwing that soft blue glow across the water the way they do every evening. And she reached over and took my hand the way she has 10,000 times over 39 years, and she didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, you did the right thing, Walter. Slow and quiet and right. I think about that dinner sometimes, the exact moment Marcus set that card down in my son's hand. Not with satisfaction. I want to be honest about that, because there wasn't much satisfaction in it, not really. What I felt, and what I still feel when I think about it, is something closer to relief, the specific relief of a man who has spent 3 years quietly carrying a story he didn't know was a lie, and finally got to set it down. Useless was the word Bradley used that night, the word he'd apparently used more than once, according to people at his firm who'd overheard him tell it as a joke at other dinners, other rooms, long before I ever knew he was telling it at all. Grandpa doesn't pay for anything anymore. He meant it as a punchline about an old man who'd faded out of relevance. What he never understood, what none of them understood until that card landed back in his hand, was that the old man had been paying for everything the entire time, quietly, without asking for credit, the same way I built a warehouse into a company 38 years ago, one invoice at a time, never needing anyone to applaud along the way. Claire called me last week, out of the blue, on a Tuesday, Her voice full of something I hadn't heard from her in a long time. Something light. She'd just gotten the paperwork from the mortgage company. She cried on the phone the way I knew she would. And then she said something I'm going to remember for a long time. "Dad," she said, "you didn't have to do all of that." Yeah, I told her I did. We don't always get to choose which of our children learns the value of what we've built and which one learns to take it apart. But we do get to choose, eventually, who we keep handing the keys to. I spent 3 years handing mine to the wrong son without knowing it, and one dinner finding out exactly where they'd gone. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. I'll see you on the next one.